Okay. Good. Yeah, we're live.
We're live. Hello and welcome everybody to the third episode of our Piece of the Puzzle podcast, a live interactive podcast with Pascal Gemberly and myself. And we're really thrilled and honored to have very distinguished guest with us today, our first speaker in the podcast, Dr. Juan Diaz-Prinz. And we're talking about an interesting topic, which is insider mediators and shrinking spaces for civil society. And Juan will explain a little bit more what sort of the terminology around insider mediators actually is. Let me just briefly introduce Juan for those of you who have not come across him yet. He has a really distinguished career of over 20 years as a mediator and conflict resolution practitioner. And Juan, allow me to only flag a few of your milestones in your career because of the short amount of time that we have. I think interestingly, you started out your career in the Balkans just after the war, so really interesting, working for the Office of the International Mediator in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also being a director of an NGO there for over 14 years. And you've done a lot of training and coachings really all over the world around mediation and conflict resolution. And I think really important to highlight also that most recently you were responsible for process design as a senior mediation advisor in the UN mediation standby team. And also before that, a mediation expert and acting director of the inclusive peace process and reconciliation team at the United States Institute for Peace. So thank you so much, Juan, for joining us joining us today, for making the time, and we really look forward to the conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this issue, which is super important, especially in light of everything that's going on in the world at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Juan. Welcome. Yeah, it's a broad topic. We'll have roughly half an hour to talk about this with Juan, maybe a few minutes more. We also have the chat as always. So our viewers, you can ask questions and contribute on the YouTube chat that you see just on the right side of the video. And then I take the questions up and direct them to Juan. And yeah, the topics of today, we will talk about the definition of insider mediators. What types of levels are we talking about? There's international, national, there's community-based. The profiles, of course, what type of profiles can or should insider mediators have? Challenges that may arise with this type of mediation. And of course, some concrete examples, as you have many, Juan, as you have a lot of real-life experience. And it's, again, great to have you here and to start with this. So I thought about how to start this off, and maybe not all our viewers are maybe deeply inside the topic. So start with an easy question. So what is an insider mediator, Juan?
Thank you very much. And for those of you who don't know or haven't heard the term, I think there are several documents online, either from the UN or the EU or OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, that will give you a real definition. But basically, insider mediators are people working in their communities who have legitimacy, who are network, who have the context and the contacts to be able to do work in their community. Now, in order to understand this, you have to go back to the late 90s, and this term didn't exist. This term starts to develop when there was so much international intervention all over the world. And internationals were thinking, you know what? We need allies. We need people. And so well-intentioned international organizations like the EU or the UN started to develop a body of knowledge around people that are working in their communities with dialogue facilitation, mediation, reconciliation, and began to do an international local collaboration. So a lot of the literature focuses on intra-state conflicts, which was what was going on in the early 2000s. And there's a lot of capacity building for these people working in their communities, doing dialogue facilitation, doing mediation. The problem that we have is that there's a different group of people who are working in their countries, but not in communities. They're working on the national level. For example, Betty Begombe in Uganda, or Pedro Diaz Bloom in Venezuela. You have a lot of people working to try to change their national frameworks and mediate between government and opposition. But we don't really focus on these actors. And these actors are very different. And I think here in our conversation, maybe we can talk about the different challenges that they face.
So you gave this historical development from the civil conflicts that it arose from there, for having local experts. So in how far actually then are those mediators neutral? Do they have to be neutral? That's the classical understanding of mediation, is that the mediator has to be neutral. Can we understand this as just another mediator or just a different level, or is that profile different? Is the mediator, in terms of, because you mentioned it, that they have legitimacy, they're involved in the community, is the profile basically different, or is it just the same type of people, same person, same profile, a mediator, just on another level?
Pascal, that's a very good question. I think that nobody who works in their conflict is able to detach from those conflicts. But I also don't necessarily believe that they need to. When we've done capacity building throughout the years, we have conveyed the importance of impartiality. I think there's been a little bit of a stereotype that people cannot be impartial, but they can. And even when they're not impartial, it doesn't necessarily mean they cannot work in their conflicts. So for example, Pedro Diaz Bloom in Venezuela, when I met him, he is from the opposition. He's been mediating between government and opposition people. And when I met him, when we started talking, he had a very robust insider mediator initiative. But I also realized that the opposition wasn't that interested in participating in his initiative because they felt that he was partial to the government. So we sat and we talked about it. And Pedro and I came to an understanding that, yes, when you're working, people need to feel you're being impartial. What your private opinions are, and people have and that's what we always call multi-partial. People forget the part of multi-partial mediation, that mediators have their own partiality as well, right? We always say, I'm multi-partial to the parties, but we forget I'm also a human being as a mediator. And I think insider mediators bring that to reality. They are there. When we leave, when the United States stops funding all US aid, for example, which we all saw very dramatically a week ago, 2 weeks ago, those mediators are there and they don't leave. They continue to do the work. So I'm not 100% sure that it's so important, Pascal, like you asked. I think more importantly is that they understand that if they're not being impartial or perceived as impartial, that some people may not participate in their initiatives.
I think you highlight a really interesting point, Juan, and that is maybe one of the challenges as well that we look at later, which is, I think you mentioned also the difference between your own stance, your impartiality, and the perception of whether you are impartial or not. And I think this is something it's two different things, right? One is how you deal with it, and then how you are being perceived just because you belong into a certain category of people. And I think this is obviously with social media and with an increasing polarity getting more complicated, but this is maybe something we can talk about later. I have one question, if I may, that ties a little bit into the profile of insider mediators. How are insider mediators chosen? Is there, is there a standard rule? Does it depend on the context? If you, from your experience, if you look at how they are chosen, what are some of the key points that you have to take into consideration when you choose, when an insider mediator is chosen?
Okay, so let's take a one step back and think a little bit about terminology. So they're not chosen; they are insider mediators. The question is, when do we, meaning me, for example, Juan, when do I decide to work with an insider mediator? And imagine that you are doing a mediation in your own country. There are thousands of mediators in your country. You also don't work with every mediator. You choose people or mediators that have similar styles, similar thinking. So what I like to tell people, especially international NGOs, is take your time, get to know people, think through what is it that they bring to the table, what is it that you bring to the table, what is it that you would like to co-create with them. I have a little bit of a problem that most of the literature right now talks about insider mediators providing services to international NGOs. Insider mediators are not service providers. They're actually doing the work. We're not mediating, they're the ones mediating. So to me, it's, if Pascal is an insider mediator, I want to first understand what are his values, what is he trying to do, how is he trying to do it, can I be added value? So in Venezuela, where I worked for 3 years, Pedro Diaz-Blum came to me and said, look, I have this mechanism, but I'm not very good at developing formats. I was like, oh, I'm good at that. So Pedro and I had a similar understanding that I'm not Venezuelan. I don't want to be Venezuelan, and I do not need to take credit for solving the Venezuelan conflict. And he didn't want to be a mediator, but he needed mediation support because what he was trying to do was to build relationships and he needed formats. So we were a match because our values, our thinking, and our added value were together. And so usually when you do the stakeholder mapping, I think what now people need to do is what's called a mediation landscape mapping. In every country of the world, Katrin, there are people already mediating without any training, without any titles, without any certificates. They're doing it and they're doing it for free. They're doing it because it's their country. So for us is to basically assess what is out there and which actors I can work with.
I think that's an important point that you point out. So existing initiatives, existing mediators who are there, they do it for the country, they do it certainly very well. Because some might have the impression that, okay, insider mediators are maybe picked or created for a specific mediation, an international actor doing a mediation in a certain context, and then we're going to create this mediation process. We're going to create everything, like, and we choose people, we select people, we train them. So does this exist as well, or is it like good practice probably the other one? But what about the second?
So I'll give you an example which was really interesting. Back in I guess it was end of 2018, early 2019, when the Sudan crisis, where the civil society and the military junta were facing each other, there was a group of insider mediators. They were business people. And they were trying to de-escalate. And I was asked, I was working for the United States Institute of Peace. My thoughts are with everyone who works for USIP at the moment, as we all know, the challenging times the Institute is going through. At that time, USIP asked me to set up a crisis hotline for these mediators. And I was meeting them every day on WhatsApp and answering their questions. And then all of a sudden, the EU and a couple of other organizations were sending diplomats to mediate the conflict. And so my job was to help the internationals who were coming understand that these people were already there. They were doing the job. And so you need to not only understand that they're there, but also maybe share information, what you can, maybe see if sometimes just meeting these people is really important. And Pascal, one of the biggest challenges insider mediators have is that governments don't always have an interest in insider mediation. Why? Because they have an interest in international attention. They don't always have an interest in local people getting involved with government and opposition and things like that. So what you might find is that people will doubt the intentions of the insider mediator for political purposes. And there's a lot of work to be done. So you'll find that insider mediators actually appreciate working with other mediators, international mediators, because it brings them a certain amount of legitimacy from the outside. But it doesn't mean their work is any less, right? They do the work. Sometimes they just need door openers for like foreign ministers from Ethiopia or the EU or Germany arriving in the country who may not be willing to meet with them, because when you're coming from abroad, you do a risk assessment. If I meet this insider mediator, who do I meet? And will the government be angry with me? Will the opposition be angry with me? So there's a lot of risk assessment. Insider mediators need a little bit of that support.
This is an interesting point that you just mentioned, because I think when we talk about peace mediation and look at, so we often have this high level, charismatic mediator in mind that has a lot of standing and backup and sort of the political clout to resolve a conflict. So in your experience, as you mentioned, so if the insider mediators don't necessarily have that political support from within their own system,
So
have you seen processes where there also, as you said, there's different levels, right? There's space for everybody. So you have different levels, you have different types of actors come in. Have you seen processes where this worked really well, where you could also feel that insider mediators got the political backing that they needed and still having the right space for them to work?
So, and this is where I mentioned earlier that there are different levels. I think if you look at some of the work UNDP and the EU is doing around the world, at the community level, there's a lot of success. Community leaders, clan elders, religious leaders, women, youth who are trained in mediation and then go into the community and they mediate local conflicts as a form of conflict prevention or de-escalation as part of implementing a peace agreement, for example. So in the Western Balkans, in Ethiopia, for example, there are these kind of mediators. Also in Latin America, in Colombia, there are local mediators. Where it gets a little more challenging is at the national level. And we haven't focused for a long time on this issue because there was a kind of prevailing mentality that at the national level, it becomes more difficult. As I mentioned, for example, the Venezuelan case that I mentioned, he had a lot of trouble establishing his legitimacy with certain sectors that felt that he was just getting involved in things that didn't concern him. But what was really interesting that at one point when I was working with him, because they keep doing it, right? And at one point, he was the only game in Caracas in terms of dialogue. He was the only person in Caracas that could sit opposition and government people together. So internationals, even though they weren't publicly meeting with him, were asking him to facilitate contacts across the divide. So sometimes they don't have legitimacy, but those could be for political purposes. More important, this is what I see, is if there is a person like Betty Bigombe in Uganda or Alice Derito in Kenya, or the Liberian women, and the famous case of the Liberian women who stand up and say, we will not be deterred. I think we have a responsibility when we talk about do no harm to say, you know, how can I help that space? Can I do anything that allows them to continue to develop their indigenous mediation work or facilitation work? I don't necessarily always have to work with them, But what I don't want to do is hurt their chances of succeeding.
So, yeah, you mentioned the important success of insider mediators on the grassroots level, local level, and the national level. There are additional questions that have to be solved. Does it make sense to differentiate between the tracks to say what's the role of international mediators, insider mediators? What is the interface? What is the coordination?
So Pascal, I'm going to tread into a little bit of modern day politics.
Yeah.
We're seeing that the United States is withdrawing from many parts of the world now. The new administration announced yesterday that it will not be getting involved in democracy, human rights, and governance issues, right? So I think that we're going to see a vacuum in terms of international funding for mediation work. Now more than ever, insider mediators are going to become even more important. These national people who have been around, who weren't getting any funding, are going to actually need support because many countries are not funding mediation work anymore in these countries. And yes, Europe is still funding, but maybe not at the same level as it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago, because there are other priorities from Gaza to Ukraine. So the whole entire peace building sector is suffering in terms of funding. Right now, insider mediators are needed. They're more cost effective. They have the connections. They have the legitimacy. And what they need sometimes is very minimal capacity building, not in what is mediation, but what are the different types of tools like scenario planning, open space, anything that can help them to offer the conflict parties they're working with different perspectives, right? So I think right now the focus will shift in terms of literature, in terms of international donations from community work to the national level. And I expect that it's going to become even more and more important in the next 5 years.
This is, yeah, I think you mentioned one of the key challenges right now, I think, and that has, I guess resources have decreased in the past couple of years in any case, and it's now really drastic. So thanks for flagging that. And I like that you already made a little bit of a recommendation in what it is that we should be looking at right now. And I think maybe we could come back to this later. I would really like to hear from you a little bit more what some of the concrete recommendations are that you have for either people already working on a local level or community level, or would like to do that. But maybe as we looked at challenges, so in addition to this challenge of shrinking resources and sort of a withdrawal of focus on peace building, what else are some of the challenges that you've seen in the past couple of years occur for insider mediators in particular?
So I think it's a challenge for the cooperation between international or external mediators and insider mediators. So we haven't paid a lot of attention to the mandate of insider mediators. I think the more that we start to work with insider mediators, the more that we need to think about how to craft mandates that basically determine what is the role of the external mediator, what's the role of the insider mediator. And let's be clear for everybody who's listening, the word insider is a word that is used from outside. Nobody in their country calls themselves an insider mediator, right? And whenever I talk about this in countries, they're like, we are insiders, but yes, we don't call ourselves, we call ourselves just mediators.
Just mediators.
So I think one of the issue is finding out how those insider mediators can do mediation and not just services for external projects on mediation. The second conflict or problem that we have is, and I don't know how much viewers are aware, but there are over 65 countries in the world that have passed laws against civil society taking international funding. So in this space, what my colleagues around the world are saying, especially women-led organizations, that the space for civil society is shrinking and that people are afraid to participate in subnational dialogues. They are, so for example, after Maduro won the presidency, or let's just say declared himself president last year, and they arrested a lot of people, Pedro's mediation initiative basically just stopped because people are afraid. There are new laws saying if you are getting funding or if you are collaborating with international or external organizations, you can be arrested. And this is happening in Eastern Europe, it's happening in the MENA region, in Africa. And I think this is the biggest challenge for insider mediators because they don't have local resources. The government will not fund them. So they depend on international resources. That's the second challenge. The third challenge for us, and I don't know, maybe you can help me frame this because I don't always get it right, but we have developed in peace mediation basically principles and frameworks that are sometimes conceived from a transatlantic perspective. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't always synergize with local mediation practices. And when I go to, for example, I did some work with facilitators in the MENA region, in Iraq, in Libya, in Tunisia. What they said was, please stop coming and trying to tell us what mediation is. Please stop telling me what peace building is. Please stop telling me how to do active listening. Those things don't work here. We have our own system of listening. We have our own system of dialogue, and we want to do it our way. So I think the challenge for everybody is to ensure that whatever capacity building that is being done, it should start from the insider. And the insider mediator should determine what their capacity needs are. The fourth challenge, and I'll stop here, is I also don't know if you know, but there have been over 80 protests in the last year, youth protests. We are challenged at the moment in mediation with protest movements, disruptor movements. These movements are led by youth. They're unhappy with their governments. They're unhappy with the situation. And their purpose is to disrupt peace processes because they think this is all a bunch of elite stuff happening in their country that's not going to benefit. I'm being very superficial and very general. Please allow me for the sake of time, right? The problem for the insider mediator is, I would say most probably, they know all the protesters, they know all the government people, they know all the opposition people. And this whole new level of protest, which is it's no longer confined to the conflict parties, but we're finding that all stakeholders are getting involved. And so how do you continue a nonviolent action, alternative to violence process when half the people in your insider mediation process is participating in protests and things like that? So I think there's going to be a lot of work around how do you integrate protest movements into peace processes, into mediation, and into dialogues.
Interesting. I think there's the good news is, I think, to the challenges, that for some of the challenges that you mentioned, there is some work being undertaken around it, right? And I know but Anadot did already research into Islamic principles in law and mediation to really make sure that this is integrated as well in their approach. And as you said, also in the protest movement, right? I know Berghof has worked quite a bit on what do protest movements, what does it mean? How do we integrate it into peace process work? So that's really encouraging in a way, that I think that some of the challenges you've mentioned have been on our radar for a while, and that some of the organizations have at least started to look at them.
Exactly. The one thing I would say about protest movements is the more we investigate them, the more that we realize, or we are learning, that they don't always see mediation as a value add. Because sometimes for protest movements, it's capitulation, it's compromise, it takes away their only leverage. So we're going to need to do a little more. It's not about integrating them into existing processes. It's about how do you make a process attractive for a new non-traditional actor that it's emerging as a force for change, which are advocating for radical change. And protest movements advocate for radical change. How do you, the United States, the MAGA movement is a protest movement, which is now in government, and we see their disruptive nature. How do you bring them into a dialogue with civil society? And we're going to see this more and more as our classical assumptions about mediation will be challenged by different types of mediation around the world.
Yeah. Well, probably the challenge on that is that protest movements have a disruptive approach. It's to make noise, it's to make change, and mediation is more the opposite. No, it's to calm things down, bring everything on a track, bring dialogue, and people exchange and make things quiet and peaceful and dialogue. And protest movements are not necessarily in that vision of how to bring change.
No, and they also don't have the traditional decision-making structures that are expected by the traditional actors. So if you have an insider mediator or just a mediator in a country, and we've taught them classical mediation styles, and now they're being confronted with new and emerging forms of actors, we need to adapt our tools, and we need to work with our colleagues in different national contexts to identify what actually works in their context. I think we have to learn to adapt our own tools, not just to the conflict in the country, but to things that work. Sometimes when I work in Venezuela, Pedro will say to me, after I give him advice on something, he'll say, okay, I have to turn that into a Venezuelan idea. And then he'll say, I have to Venezuelanize it. And then, he'll translate it. And my initial instincts were to say to him, no, Pedro, you're not being impartial, so resisting that and saying, Pedro, I give you what I know, you do with it what you want. And we outsiders have to learn that because I don't think we know that, but the conflicts are changing at the moment. And so we have to flip the model around. It's going to be more insider and less outsider. Before it was more outsider and less insider. And I think this is going to be turned on its head.
I think you spot on. I think Juan, like for me, one of the issues I felt is also we as the outsiders go somewhere else to mediate, whereas our own countries fall apart. And I think what you mentioned just right now, the US is the perfect example where it feels like we have sort of focused on the wrong spot.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the current changes in international peace building is going to require us to rethink our instruments and our tools in mediation. And here I would make an appeal that we include a lot of insider mediators in our review of existing tools so that we have a much more colorful, much more international understanding of what works. The other thing I think, when we talk about multi-track, we've always talked until now about insider mediators working in communities and subnational level. But what I'm seeing is that people are working regionally. There's a lot of experience sharing. I think there's a lot more that insiders can do in the outside in sharing their experiences, especially many of them that are working in under authoritarian regimes. And so I think that insider-outsider dichotomy is going to disappear little by little.
Yeah, and it's also about what you mentioned, the localization to Venezuelize your approaches and so on. I also read in one of the publications that it's also about the agenda, not necessarily political agenda, but also maybe project agenda. That, for instance, the international mediator might have some timelines and expectations, but maybe it's not time for a certain step, and then the locals know much better. They know, okay, now it's the right moment. Now I feel it, and the outsider does not have this sensitivity. And
again, coming back to Venezuela, because it's so fresh in my mind because a lot has happened in the last 3 years there. The Boston group in Venezuela got a lot of international funding for its dialogue and mediation work. And about 6 months before the election, he decided to go to London and learn English. And everybody was like, you should be there now, right now. You should be doing mediation right now. And he's like, no, there's nothing I can do here. He's like, this story has to pass because I have to pick up the pieces later after the election. And so for us to understand that insiders have their pulse on the dynamics and the politics of their country, and they know when to intervene, they know when they have to be quiet, and they know when they can make a move, and they don't follow these project cycles. So to me, funding has to also be not only creative and evolving, but it also has to be a little longer term, right? With the idea that there's a lot of relationship building, a lot of trust building, a lot of networking, and then there's a lot of events. Those things don't get lost when dialogue stops. On the contrary, at the moment in Venezuela, there's no dialogue really possible. But what you see is that the network is still there of people who were in the dialogue. And so, and even in the Balkans, people that I talk to that are now mediators, they have moved to the private sector for a while because maybe right now they can't do a certain political dialogue. So we have to always trust that the insider knows best in terms of mediation.
Yeah, that sounds like a good recommendation. Maybe to start wrapping it up a little bit, what kind of recommendations can we give to our viewers and listeners that are either local mediators or international mediators? I don't know, main points that you would like to share.
So I've said a few of these, but I'll just maybe summarize a couple of them. I think number one, we really have to ask ourselves, why do I want to work with an insider? And if you can't answer that question, you haven't done yet your homework to be able to engage.
And the insider probably the same. Why do I want to work with an outsider? Or not?
Yes, but don't forget that you're going to their country. They're doing their work. You are interfering in their conflict.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, before possibly accepting, reflect well about if I need it, don't need it. Does it make sense in that sense?
Totally. But I think when we come from outside, what's really important is to really answer the question, how am I added value to existing processes that are there? Do a mediation landscape mapping, which is different from your stakeholder mapping. Do not mix stakeholder mapping with mediation landscape mapping. I think when you're going to work with a mediator, an insider mediator, you need to secure funding for that mediator, which is different from project funding. The worst thing you could do is build up the collaboration with an insider mediator, and then in the middle of the project say, I'm really sorry, but there's no more funding for you. We drop you, right? Because they are counting on this and they're building also their strategy. So be honest and transparent about what kind of funding is available or not available. If there are laws of the closing of civil society space, you need to have a risk assessment, definitely about what is possible in terms of insider mediation. And lastly, and this is for the people who are not in their own countries, who work in, let's say, third countries, don't forget to talk about the insider mediation processes that are going on in those countries, because the more you talk about them, the more that people will pay attention to their work. Sometimes in our multi-track approaches, we kind of forget that they are at the center of the rest of the multi-track, right? So I think those are some recommendations that I would give you. And don't forget the mandate question. Once you agree on collaboration, spell out mandates. Who does what in mediation? I think that's super, super important. It's helped me a lot when I work with insiders I actually send not a contract, but something that looks like a contract that says, this is what we're doing.
Wow, Juan, this is so rich. We had like so many points in such a short amount of time. I'm sure like I have a lot more questions, but we're running out of time. And I think this is something, such a broad topic with so many interesting questions connected to it, that we may want to pick up some areas in particular, maybe to do a deep dive in the future.
Yeah, that would be, I think that's really great. And I think if I can encourage people to do more research, not on community level insider mediators, but more of these celebrity personalities, people who have risen up to the national level, and find out their successes. Where did they get it? How did they get it? We need more information, and there's a little bit of a gap in the research. So if you're doing research out there, please go ahead and focus on this category of insider mediators.
Okay, super interesting. Thanks for flagging that.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk to anybody on insider mediation. Thank you so much.
Great. Well,
yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Juan, do you have, sorry, just about maybe if somebody wants to get in touch with you, or do you have, we can also put, information in the video description, a link, or I don't know, anything people can get in touch.
Yeah. So I have a website called the conflictmanagementspace.org. It's just one word, conflictmanagementspace.org. And my contact details are on the website, and there's some webinars, and there's some other videos that I put up, and I'm happy to exchange with anybody who's listening. Feel free to send an email, and I'm happy to collaborate with anybody. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you on the issue.
Perfect.
We feel honored that you're our first guest. It was really a pleasure to have you.